most important things we give are often not recognized, not because the people who received them didn't feel it, not because the giving wasn't real, but because life moves forward, and the moment of the gift is followed by 1,000 other moments, and the specific act of giving, the specific kindness, the specific presence, the specific thing you offered, gets absorbed into the larger story of a life and does not always come back to you in the form of acknowledgement. And we have to decide what we think about that. Whether the giving is diminished by the going unrecognized, whether the unacknowledged gift was less real than the acknowledged one, and whether we would have given it differently if we had known it would not be named. Bob Hope made people laugh for 70 years. It is difficult to describe the scope of what that career contained, because the entertainment landscape has changed so fundamentally that the specific nature of his reach requires some context. He was, for much of the 1940s through the 1960s, one of the most recognizable men in America. The radio programs, the films, the television specials. But what is less often discussed, what tends to be mentioned but rarely examined, is the Christmas tours. The USO tours that he began during World War II and continued with remarkable consistency for decades after. Every year, sometimes in multiple trips, he went to where the soldiers were, to Korea, to Vietnam, to the Pacific, to the Gulf, to wherever American military personnel were stationed, in whatever conditions, at whatever distance from home. He went, and he made them laugh. The people who were there, the soldiers and sailors and airmen who saw him in those conditions, in the camps and the forward bases and the places where the last thing anyone expected was a comedian from Hollywood, described the experience in ways that are consistent across the decades and the different conflicts. It was not simply entertainment. It was the recognition that someone knew they were there. Someone who did not have to be there, who could have stayed home, who had nothing to gain from the difficulty and the travel and the specific discomfort of performing in those conditions, had chosen to come. The choice itself communicated something. It said, "You are not forgotten. You are worth the trouble." And that message, received by people who were sometimes very far from home and very uncertain about what was waiting, that message mattered in a way that went past what any comedy performance could produce. He kept going, even when it became politically complicated. And during Vietnam, it was very politically complicated. Even when the criticism came from various directions about what the tours represented and what they endorsed, he kept going. Not because he was naive about the complexity, but because in the middle of the complexity, there were young people who were there and who needed someone to come, and he was someone who could come. And so he did. For 50 years of Christmas tours he did, until his body simply would not allow it anymore. In his later years, well into his 90s, he lived to be 100. He spoke in interviews about the things he was most grateful to have done. The films were mentioned, the radio programs, the decades of television. But the tours, the Christmas tours, the soldiers, he returned to those with a quality that was different from how he talked about the rest of the career. More personal, less professional. the quality of something that had mattered not because of what it produced for him, but because of what it gave to the people who received it. And he said something, in one of those conversations, that people who heard it remembered. He said that he had never fully gotten used to the feeling of performing for the troops. Not the logistics, he had done it enough that the logistics became routine, but the feeling, the specific quality of looking out at thousands of young faces in a foreign place and watching the laughter change something in them. Something tense and uncertain becoming, for a few minutes, simply human, simply glad to be alive, simply laughing. He said he had never gotten used to the privilege of that. And he also said that most of the people he had performed for, he would never see again. That most of them had gone home, or had not gone home, and that the specific encounter, the specific moment of the performance and the laughter, was something he had given without knowing what happened to the people who received it. Without ever knowing, in most cases, whether it had mattered, whether it had changed anything. Whether the laughter in a base camp in the middle of a war had made a difference in a life he would never follow. He didn't know. He had never known. And he had kept going anyway. That is a particular kind of giving. The kind that does not know its effect, that gives in to the uncertainty, that offers something genuine in a moment when you cannot know what will be done with it, and trusts that the giving was real, regardless of whether the acknowledgement ever arrives. Maybe you've given things like that, without knowing what they became in the person who received them. Without the thank you that would have told you the giving mattered. Without the closure of knowing that what you offered was received in the way you hoped. And maybe you have wondered in the quiet hours whether it made a difference. Whether the specific kindness or the specific presence or the specific thing you gave, whether it landed anywhere. Whether it was worth the giving. It was. It always is. Not because you can know the outcome, but because the giving itself, the act of choosing to offer something genuine in a moment when you could have withheld, is real. It happened. It was received in some form by someone who was changed by the receiving, even if they never said so, even if they didn't know how to say so, even if life moved on so quickly that the specific moment of the gift was absorbed into the larger story before either of you could name it. The gift was real, and the effect was real, and it is still, in some form, moving. Bob Hope understood this, not as a comfortable abstraction, as a hard-won conviction that had been tested against decades of giving in to the uncertainty. He gave, year after year, to people he would not see again, in conditions that were not comfortable and to circumstances that were not simple. And he held, across all of it, the belief that the giving was its own justification, that you did not need the acknowledgement for the gift to be real, that the laughter in the camp, in that moment, in those conditions, for those specific young people, was enough. Whether or not he ever knew what happened to them, whether or not they ever had the chance to tell him what it meant, he gave it anyway. And it was enough. He died in 2003, having outlasted almost everyone who had been part of the same entertainment era. And the tributes that came, the formal acknowledgments, the public expressions of gratitude, were substantial, as they should have been. The visible record was extraordinary, but the people who wrote about him and spoke about him in those days kept returning to the same thing. Not the films, not the television specials, the tours, the choosing to go year after year into the places where the young people were. That is the giving that people could not let go of. That is the thing that has lasted longest in how he is remembered. Not the comedy, as beloved as it was. The choosing, the showing up, the giving of himself without knowing what it would produce into the uncertainty of all those distant places. What are you giving without knowing its effect? What are you offering in the ordinary encounters of an ordinary life that you may never be thanked for? The patience in a difficult relationship. The presence you bring to someone who needs someone to be present. The specific care you give, quietly, consistently, without announcement, to the people in your life who have come to rely on it without perhaps saying so. These are gifts, real ones, even without the acknowledgement, even without the thank you. They are moving in the people who receive them, right now, in ways you may never fully see. So take a slow breath and let yourself receive, for a moment, the recognition that the giving has always been worth it. Not because the effect is always visible, because the giving itself, the act of choosing to offer something genuine when you could have withheld, is what integrity looks like in the texture of an ordinary life. That is the legacy, not the acknowledgments, the choosing, the showing up, the giving year after year into the uncertainty of whether it mattered. Because it did. Because it always does. Because kindness received, however unacknowledged, never simply disappears. It persists in the person who received it, in ways that continue long past the moment of giving. And that persistence is enough. It was enough for Bob Hope, across 50 years of choosing to go. And it is enough for the giving you do, in your own way, in the ordinary, unwitnessed moments of an ordinary life. It is always enough. There is one more thing his story gives us, something about what it means to give not because of what you receive from it, but because of who you are. Bob Hope could have stopped the tours. Many times over the 50 years, the rational calculation would have said, stop. He was famous enough that the reputation benefit had been established. He was old enough that the physical demands were significant. The political complexity, at certain points, made the tours genuinely costly in terms of public perception. And he kept going. Not because the calculations said go, because it was who he was. Because the young people in the distant places needed someone to come, and he was someone who could, and not going would have been a form of not being himself. That alignment between what you do and who you are at the deepest level is one of the things that makes a legacy last. Not the impressive record, the consistency of the character. The evidence, accumulated over a long life of ordinary choices, that the person behind the public face was genuinely the person the choices described. Bob Hope kept going to the soldiers because he was the kind of person who went to the soldiers. That is what the legacy says, finally. And it says it more clearly than any tribute or award or formal recognition could. The choosing, year after year, is its own testament. As you're choosing, whatever it is you choose, again and again, in the quiet accumulation of an ordinary life, is yours.